Hey, welcome back to Iron Maidens, the podcast where we honor the fearless women who have fought and bled for our country. And I'm your host, Bevin Goldsmith. And today, we're going to be tackling a topic that doesn't get nearly enough attention: women in combat. Those stories are very undertold, very overshadowed. Too often, their contributions are overlooked or erased, but the reality is women have been fighting in wars for centuries. Whether they were leading armies, disguising themselves to serve, or proving their worth on modern battlefields, these warriors have played an undeniable role in shaping military history. From Joan of Arc to today's frontline female soldiers, we're going to dive deep into the stories of resilience, sacrifice, and unbreakable willpower. Because let's be real, these women weren't just allowed to fight, they had to fight to even be recognized. And I don't know if I've mentioned this on a previous recording, but I am a huge history nerd. My people are General Patton and Joan of Arc. Those are two of my favorite people. Take Joan of Arc. You've got this young lady, Joan of Arc, who just walks into a medieval battlefield like, hey, God sent me. And somehow everyone just went with it. Imagine being a 15th century general, spending years perfecting battle tactics, only to have a female teenager in armor show up, take command, and immediately start winning. Honestly, the real miracle wasn't the voices she heard, it was that a bunch of grown men actually listened to her. Growing up, growing up with three brothers and serving dual service in the Air National Guard and the Army, I know exactly what it's like to play in the sandbox with the guys, literally and figuratively. Whether it's whether I was dodging elbows at the dinner table from my brothers or holding my own in a squad, I learned real quick that sometimes you have to stand your ground, and other times you just got to let it go. Picking your battles isn't about backing down. It's about knowing when to push forward and when to let the storm pass you so you can win the war. So, because today's episode is all about setting the record straight, this is Iron Maidens, and it's time to tell the stories that history forgot. We're going to start with a lady from medieval times, and her name was Aethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, 870 to 918 in England, known as the warrior queen who fought the Vikings. So who was she? Aethelflaed was a Saxon warrior, strategist, and ruler of Mercia in Anglo-Saxon England. She was the eldest daughter of Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, and later became Lady of the Mercians, ruling in her own right. She is best known for her military campaigns against the Vikings, her role in fortifying England, and her strategic leadership in the unification of England. So, unlike queens who ruled through male heirs or husbands, Aethelflaed commanded armies, made strategic military decisions, and directly influenced the unification of England all on her own. She did not do it through a man. So, getting into her campaigns against the Vikings, as the leader of Mercia, Aethelflaed focused on fortifying her kingdom and launching counterattacks against Viking-held territories. She built a network of fortified towns and burhs to defend against Viking raids, captured Derby in 917 AD, one of the key Viking strongholds in the region. She won a decisive battle at Leicester in 918 AD, bringing Viking-occupied lands under Mercian control. Her efforts weakened Viking dominance in England, paving the way for future unification. Her success was so great that even the Vikings of York, which would be modern-day Yorkshire, were prepared to submit to her rule, something that was unprecedented for a Saxon woman. To put this even more into perspective for you guys, some tidbits about the Vikings, if you don't know anything about how savage this army was. The Vikings who fought against Aethelflaed were some of the most ruthless warriors in history. They were part of what was called the Great Heathen Army, which was a massive Viking force. They were infamous for their brutal raids on monasteries, towns, villages, just killing indiscriminately. They slaughtered monks, they burned churches, they enslaved survivors. Their army destroyed Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, reducing them to pure rubble and forcing kings to surrender or die. Definitely their army would be comparable to Genghis Khan's Mongols, who wiped out entire cities in their conquest. And taking it a step further, in regards to torture, they're very well known for what is called the Blood Eagle torture. So one of the most terrifying Viking executions was the Blood Eagle, which is where they would cut open a victim's back, pull out their ribs to resemble wings, remove their lungs while they were still alive. And although debated by historians, this method was reportedly used. They were unbreakable in battle, fighting with what's known as a berserker rage. So they would enter battle in a trance-like state, feeling absolutely no pain. They used shield walls, ambush tactics, and hit-and-run attacks to decimate larger, less mobile enemies. And even when cornered, they refused to surrender, often dying in battle rather than being captured, which is very comparable to what the Japanese samurai and kamikaze pilots would do, who believed in honor through death rather than surrender. So, yeah, the Vikings who fought Aethelflaed were some of the most savage and fearless warriors in history. They had zero mercy, no fear, no limits. As I said, much like the Mongols or the samurai. So despite this, Aethelflaed outsmarted them, securing Anglo-Saxon victories and shaping the future of England. She's one of the few women in medieval history to rule and lead armies, as I said, in her own right. So just her, not through a man. Her strategic warfare against the Vikings showed that women could be just as effective as men in battle. Her actions contributed to the formation of a unified England, making her one of the most influential rulers of her time. Aethelflaed was not just a queen. She was a warrior, a tactician, a leader whose contributions to England's history deserve great recognition. I'm like, Aethelflaed was basically, she was England's first warrior queen, but she didn't have time for fancy titles. She was too busy kicking Vikings out of Mercia. While other rulers were arguing over crowns, she was out there building fortresses, leading armies, and making the Danes regret their life choices. Honestly, if medieval England had job performance reviews, she would have been the only one getting a raise. Just saying. Up next, we have my absolute favorite, Joan of Arc, from 1412 to 1431 in France, the warrior saint who defied an empire. So Joan of Arc, also known as the Maid of Orleans, was a French peasant girl who became a military leader, a war hero, and a saint. She played a pivotal role in the 100 Years' War, which went from 1337 to 1453. It was between France and England, and she led French troops to victory and secured the coronation of King Charles VII. Her story is legendary because she was a teenage girl with no formal military training, yet she convinced French leaders to let her lead an army, won battles, and ultimately became one of the most famous female warriors in history. So the siege of Orleans in 1429 was her first major victory. At 17 years old, Joan convinced the Dauphin, Charles, to let her join the army. In full armor, she led French troops to victory at the siege of Orleans, which had been under English control for months. This victory boosted French morale and turned the tide of the war, cementing her status as a military leader. So she continued leading, and eventually she had a capture and trial between 1430 and 1431. She was betrayed and captured by the Burgundians. So May of 1430, Joan was captured by the Burgundians, who were allies of England during a battle at Compiègne. The French king did not attempt to ransom her, leaving her at the mercy of the English. Go figure. So then she had a trial for heresy, 1431. The English put Joan on trial for heresy and witchcraft, accusing her of everything from wearing men's armor to falsely claiming divine guidance. She faced interrogation, psychological torture, and imprisonment for months, but never wavered in her faith or her mission. Despite being only 19 years old, she defended herself fiercely in court. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was burned alive in Rouen, France, convicted of heresy. Her last words were, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." And then her ashes were thrown into the Seine River to prevent her remains from becoming relics. In 1456, Joan's trial was actually re-examined by the Catholic Church, and she was declared innocent and a martyr. 1920, the church officially declared her a saint, making her Saint Joan of Arc. So, clearly, their plan did not work. I mean, if you look at Joan of Arc's legacy, she's now the patron saint of France and was a soldier. Her story inspired countless books, movies, and plays, making her one of the most enduring figures in military history. She remains one of the greatest examples of female leadership, faith, and bravery in combat. Why does the discussion of Joan of Arc matter in Women in Combat? She was one of the few women in medieval history to lead armies into battle. She proved that strategy, courage, and leadership are not confined to men. Her execution was politically motivated, showing how women who defied traditional roles in that day and age were often seen as threats. And her legacy continues to inspire women in combat and leadership today. So I look at this story and I think of, you've got Joan of Arc was basically the medieval definition of a girl boss. And I don't generally like using that term, but I'm going with it today. Except instead of running a company, she was running entire armies. Imagine being a fully grown knight, spending years, like I said before, training with swords, only to be out-strategized by a teenage peasant girl who said God told her what to do. And the best part, she actually won. So now we're going to move on in early modern warfare. So we're going to fast forward a few centuries, and we see women not just leading armies like they were, but also disguising themselves to fight. And we're going to start out talking about Deborah Sampson from 1760 to 1827, talking American Revolution time, her early life hardship and independence. She was born in Plimpton, Massachusetts in 1760. Deborah was one of 7 children in a poor family. Her father abandoned the family, and her mother sent Deborah into indentured servitude at age 10. Despite having little formal education, she taught herself to read and write, gaining knowledge that would later help her in her military service. And after her indentured servitude ended, she worked as a teacher and weaver, but longed for more adventure and purpose. Preaching to the choir here, girl. So she ends up disguising herself as a man and enlisting in the Continental Army. So in 1782, at the age of 21, Deborah cut her hair, bound her chest, and dressed in men's clothing to enlist in the Continental Army under the name Robert Shirtliff. She successfully fooled recruiters and was assigned to the 4th Massachusetts Regiment, where she fought in multiple battles against British forces. Imagine pulling this off in the 18th century. No ID checks, No social media, just sheer determination and a really good disguise. Also, super jealous. She didn't have to go through MEPS processing or do the duck walk. Hate the duck walk. Moving forward, so combat, when she was in combat, she got injured. She fought in skirmishes in New York, where she proved to be a fearless and capable soldier. She was wounded in battle, shot in the thigh, but refused to go to a doctor out of fear that her true identity would be discovered. So, what does she do? What any normal female does. She removes the musket ball from her leg herself using a knife and sewing needle, an act of pure grit and determination. Then she continued serving for nearly 2 years before falling ill with a fever in 1783. So most people pass out over a paper cut, but Deborah Sampson performed battlefield surgery on herself and kept going. Talk about dedication. So, discovery and discharge. While being treated for her illness, a doctor discovered she was a woman. Instead of punishing her, her commanding officer gave her an honorable discharge from the army in 1783. After the war, she married a farmer, Benjamin Gannett, and had 3 children, but she never stopped advocating for female soldiers. Respect right there. Her recognition and legacy, in 1802, she became the first American woman to go on a lecture tour, sharing her experiences in the war while wearing her military uniform. She was later awarded a pension from the U.S. government recognizing her service, one of the first women in America to receive a military pension. In 1983, she was named Massachusetts official state heroine for her contributions to American history. So why is Deborah Sampson, why does she matter in the discussion of women in combat? Once again, I think it's pretty obvious. She was one of the first women in American history to serve in the military, proving that women were just as capable as men in combat. Her disguise and determination highlighted the barriers that women faced and the lengths they led to go to in order to serve. She set a precedent for women in the U.S. military, paving the way for future generations. So, Deborah Sampson didn't just break the rules, she rewrote them. And today, her legacy reminds us that courage is simply the willingness to fight for what you believe in. So, take everything that this woman has done. You get Deborah Sampson pulls off the ultimate undercover mission. She didn't just sneak into the army. She fought, she got shot, and even performed do-it-yourself battlefield surgery on herself to keep her secret. Meanwhile, the guys around her probably thought, wow, Robert never complains about wounds. What a tough dude. Little did they know their bro was out toughing them, all while wearing a chest binder and dodging 18th century mansplaining. I mean, I'm just saying. So next up we have Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. Who is Dr. Walker? The only female Medal of Honor recipient. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker was a Civil War surgeon, prisoner of war, and women's rights activist. She remains the only woman in U.S. history to receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. A trailblazer in both medicine and the military, she defied societal norms by serving as a surgeon on the battlefield, often in men's clothing, and later fought for women's suffrage. So her early life and education, she was born in 1832 in New York to progressive parents who encouraged education for girls. One of the first women in the U.S. to earn a medical degree, graduating from Syracuse Medical College in 1855. She struggled to establish a private medical practice because patients didn't trust female doctors at the time. Imagine going through years of medical school only to hear, sorry, we don't trust you, lady, to fix a broken arm. But Mary wasn't about to take no for an answer, clearly. So her Civil War service as a surgeon was from 1861 to 1865. When Civil War broke out, Walker volunteered to serve as a surgeon from the Union Army, for the Union Army. Initially rejected because she was a woman, she worked as an unpaid field nurse before eventually being appointed as a surgeon in 1863. One of the first women ever to serve as a surgeon in the U.S. military, often crossed battle lines to treat wounded soldiers, sometimes assisting both Union and Confederate troops. She didn't just patch up soldiers, she walked straight into the war zone, providing that battlefield medicine. She proved that battlefield medicine wasn't just a man's job. In 1864, she was captured. She was a POW. So in April of 1864, while treating wounded soldiers near the front lines, Walker was captured by Confederate forces. She spent 4 months as a prisoner of war in a Confederate prison in Richmond, Virginia, refused to wear a dress, even while imprisoned, continuing to wear men's clothing, which she believed was more practical for her work. Completely understand that. Eventually exchanged for a Confederate officer in a prisoner swap. Walker was out there doing battlefield surgery in trousers, while half the country was still debating whether women should even wear pants. She was a Medal of Honor and post-war activist. So in 1865, she was awarded the Medal of Honor for her extraordinary service as a battlefield surgeon. She became the first, and so far, the only woman to receive this prestigious award. In 1917, the government tried to revoke her Medal of Honor, arguing that she hadn't engaged in direct combat. Walker refused to return it, continued wearing it daily until her death, and it was officially reinstated in 1977. Yeah, they tried to take her Medal of Honor away. She basically said, "Over my dead body." And, well, she wore it till the day she died. So, advocacy for women's rights. She became a fierce advocate for women's suffrage, arguing that the Constitution already granted women the right to vote under the 14th Amendment. Also true. Continued wearing men's clothing for the rest of her life, saying it was more comfortable and practical for her work. Often arrested for wearing pants, because apparently treating wounded soldiers was fine, but wearing trousers was a crime. She published books on women's rights, equality in marriage, and dress reform. Her legacy? Only women in U.S. history, the only woman in U.S. history to receive the Medal of Honor, one of the earliest female surgeons in the U.S. military, advocate for gender equality, proving that women were just as capable as men in medicine, war, and politics. In 2012, the U.S. Army named a medical training facility after her, honoring her contributions to military medicine. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker wasn't just ahead of her time, she was a battlefield legend, a pants-wearing pioneer, and a woman who refused to be told no. Which, to be perfectly fair, sounds like a lot of women. But we're talking about this like, she's out here saving lives on the battlefield, but people were more concerned that she was wearing pants. Imagine performing surgery under fire, only to have someone say, "Yeah, but is that really proper ladies' attire?" Walker basically spent her entire life proving that practicality was fashion. And honestly, she was right. It's hard to stitch up a wounded soldier when your hoop skirt's catching musket balls. Anyone who's worn a dress knows how drafty those things are. Moving on to women in the 20th century wars. By the 20th century, women weren't just fighting, they were now revolutionizing warfare. So starting with Harriet Tubman in the American Civil War, who was she? All right, so most people know Harriet Tubman as a conductor of the Underground Railroad, helping hundreds of enslaved people escape to freedom. But what's less talked about is that she was also a wartime spy, a scout, and guerrilla leader for the Union Army during the Civil War, making her one of the most badass women in American military history. She wasn't just freeing people in secret, she was leading soldiers into battle. So the early life of Harriet Tubman, she was born into slavery in Maryland around 1822, suffered brutal treatment and a traumatic head injury as a child, which caused lifelong seizures and vision problems. She escaped slavery in 1849, making it to Philadelphia, and later becoming a key figure in the Underground Railroad. She made 13 missions back into slave territory, rescuing over 70 people directly and helping hundreds more escape. She became so well known that slaveholders placed a $40,000 bounty on her head. Imagine being so good at your job that your enemies offer a reward just to get rid of you. Harriet Tubman was basically the most wanted woman in the South. And obviously, she did not stop there. So, during the Civil War between 1861 and 1865, once the Civil War broke out, the Union Army needed people who knew the Southern terrain and had the skills to navigate behind enemy lines. So, naturally, who better than Tubman? She was perfect for the job. So in 1862, Tubman was recruited by the Union Army to work as a spy and scout in South Carolina. She used her knowledge of secret routes, survival skills, and disguises to gather intelligence on Confederate troop movements, supply routes, and terrain. Often dressed as an old woman to blend in and gather information from enslaved people and Confederate sympathizers. She didn't just help people escape before the war. She went right back into enemy territory to take the fight to the Confederacy. Absolute legend. In 1863, she was the first woman to lead a U.S. military operation. So in June of 1863, Tubman led a Union Army raid along the Combahee River in South Carolina. She commanded 150 Black Union soldiers alongside Union Colonel James Montgomery. The mission? Destroy Confederate plantations and free enslaved people. Tubman personally guided 3 steamboats full of Union troops through Confederate-controlled waters using intelligence from local enslaved people. The raid was a huge success, resulting in over 750 enslaved people freed, many of whom later joined the Union Army. Confederate supplies, crops, and buildings were destroyed. Massive disruption of Southern supply lines. So not only was Harriet Tubman a spy, but she literally commanded a military raid that freed hundreds of people, meaning she did more in one night than most generals did in a year. When I was in the Army, people complained about doing a simple field problem. Oh no, I have to ruck 5 miles and set up a tent. Meanwhile, you have Harriet Tubman out here, sneaking past armed Confederate patrols, guiding entire groups through hostile territory with no night vision, no GPS, and a bounty on her head. And a lot of my soldiers struggled with a map and opening an MRE. But moving on, Harriet did not stop there. She had post-war work and recognition. So after the war, Tubman continued fighting for civil rights, helping freed slaves adjust to life in the North. She fought for women's suffrage, working alongside Susan B. Anthony. She opened the Harriet Tubman Home for aged African Americans for the elderly. And she was never paid fairly for her military service despite her contributions. She lived in poverty until her later years when Congress finally granted her a pension in 1899. Harriet Tubman passed away in 1913 at around 91 years old. Her legacy and military honors: she was the first woman to lead a U.S. military operation. She helped free over 70 enslaved people before the war and over 750 during the Combahee River raid. U.S. military bases, schools, and ships have been named in her honor. Harriet Tubman wasn't just a freedom fighter. She was a literal military leader. If history were fair, she'd have her own action movie by now. Harriet was basically a one-woman special forces unit before special forces were even a thing. She freed people, spied on the enemy, led a full-blown military raid, and somehow still never got paid properly for her service. The Union Army got the best scout, strategist, and fearless leader. If Harriet Tubman and General Patton had ever met, Patton would have been giving speeches about courage, and Tubman would have just nodded, because she had already been leading raids behind enemy lines before it was even a thing. Patton had tanks, a full army, and a budget. Tubman had a lantern, a revolver, and just determination, and somehow she still pulled off missions. Next up is Ludmila Pavlichenko, from 1916 to 1974, World War II, Soviet Union. She was one of the deadliest female snipers in history, with 309 confirmed kills, a number that put fear into the hearts of Nazi soldiers. Known as Lady Death,
She fought in some of the fiercest battles on the Eastern Front and later became an international icon. She was born in 1916 in Ukraine and grew up as a competitive and determined child. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, she was one of the first volunteers for the Red Army. The Soviets initially tried to push her into a nursing role, but she insisted on fighting. After proving she could shoot better than most men, she was assigned as a sniper in the 25th Rifle Division. Imagine signing up to fight Nazis and being told, sweetheart, wouldn't you rather be a nurse? Yeah, Pavlichenko basically said, nah, I'll be out here stacking bodies instead. So here she is, racking up kills, 1941. In her first 2.5 months of combat, she had 187 confirmed kills and gained a reputation as a fearless and efficient sniper. So between 1941 and 1942, she fought in the brutal siege of Sevastopol, where she increased her kill count to 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers. Survived multiple wounds, but refused to leave the front lines until she was severely injured by mortar fire in 1942. Most people tried to survive war. Pavlichenko treated it like a competition and still holds the high score. What did General Patton say? You don't win wars by dying for your country. You win wars by making the other poor bastard die for their country. In 1942, after recovering from her injuries, she was sent to the US and Canada as part of a Soviet diplomatic tour to gain support for war effort. She became the first Soviet citizen welcomed at the White House, where she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And she gave speeches where she would roast American men, famously saying, Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for far too long? So she basically came to America, looked at all the men, and said, Why aren't y'all shooting Nazis? Later in life, after the war, Pavlichenko never saw combat again, but trained new snipers for the Red Army. She was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor in the USSR. She passed away in 1974 at the age of 58, leaving behind a legacy as one of the greatest snipers in history. So why does Pavlichenko matter? Well, once again, she proved that women could be just as lethal and effective as male soldiers in combat. She showed that skill and determination and courage matter more than gender on the battlefield. She became a symbol of resistance against fascism and inspired women in military roles worldwide. Ludmila Pavlichenko didn't just fight in a war. She became the war for anyone on the wrong end of her rifle. Next, we're going to talk about the widow who bought a tank and took revenge on the Nazis. Maria Oktyabrsky, 1905 to 1944, World War II, Soviet Union. So Maria was a Soviet tank driver and mechanic during World War II, known for her unparalleled determination and vengeance against Nazi Germany. She sold all her possessions to buy a T-34 tank, personally named it the Fighting Girlfriend, and then drove it into battle herself, becoming one of the most famous female tank operators in history. In her early life, Maria was born in 1905 in Crimea. She grew up in a working-class family. She married a Soviet army officer, which gave her a deep admiration for military life. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, her husband was killed in combat, but Maria didn't find out until 2 years later due to wartime communication delays. Furious and determined to avenge her husband, she sold her house, jewelry, and personal belongings to donate 50,000 rubles to the Soviet war effort, requesting that her money be used to purchase a tank for the Red Army. Most war widows grieve. Maria got mad, bought a tank, and personally drove it into the battle to kill Nazis. We've officially reached pimp status. No judgment here. Becoming a tank driver. Surprisingly, in a surprising move, the Soviet government granted her request and let her name the tank the Fighting Girlfriend. Instead of just funding the war effort, she demanded to drive the tank herself, proving that she could operate and repair it like any other soldier. trained as a tank mechanic and driver at the Omsk Tank Academy, becoming one of the first female tank operators in history. She didn't just donate a tank. She showed up and said, "Move over, boys. I'm driving this thing." In her combat experience, Maria first saw combat in October 1943 during the Second Battle of Smolensk, led her tank straight into the fight, destroying machine gun nests and German anti-tank positions. When her tank took damage, she didn't wait for engineers. She got out under enemy fire and fixed it herself. Her fearlessness inspired her entire unit, proving that she was not just a propaganda symbol, but a true warrior. Yeah, most soldiers call for a mechanic when their tank gets hit. Maria got out, grabbed her tools, and fixed it while bullets were flying. In January 1944, during a battle, Maria's tank was once again hit. As always, she jumped out to repair it under heavy German fire, but this time she was hit by shrapnel in the head. She fell into a coma for 2 months before passing away on March 15th, 1944. That's amazing. She fixed her tank one last time, but unfortunately, this time was the time the battlefield got the best of her. She was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, became a symbol of Soviet female strength and resilience in World War II, one of the most revered and one of the few women in history to personally operate and fight in a tank on the front lines. She wasn't just supporting the war effort, she was on the front lines. She proved that women, once again, could be just as fearless, skilled, and effective as a male soldier. And her story is one of pure determination, vengeance, and courage. She literally bought her way into combat and made it count. Well, once again, Maria didn't wait for revenge. She bought a tank, trained to drive it, and made the Nazis regret everything. If that's not hardcore, I don't know what is. I want a tank. I want to buy a tank. Unfortunately, I don't think my driveway can support that, and I live in a subdivision. Also, I don't think my fiance would appreciate that. Actually, he would. He'd also be the first person to want to put Marine Corps bumper stickers all over the back of it, as he is a Marine. Next up, we're going to talk about the only American female nurse killed in action in Vietnam. Sharon Lane, 1943 to 1969, Vietnam. Who was she? First Lieutenant Sharon Lane was a U.S. Army nurse who served during the Vietnam War. She was the only American female nurse killed in action by enemy fire in the conflict, making her a symbol of sacrifice and dedication. Unlike many nurses who were stationed in relatively secure areas, Lane volunteered for dangerous assignments and was known for her compassion, toughness, and relentless work ethic. Lane was born July 7th, 1943 in Zanesville, Ohio, and raised in Canton, Ohio. She studied nursing at Altman Hospital School of Nursing and graduated in 1965. She joined the U.S. Army Nurse Corps in 1968 because she wanted to serve her country and help soldiers in need. A lot of people join the military for the adventure. Sharon Lane joined because she actually wanted to make a difference. Her service in Vietnam, she was assigned to the 312th Evacuation Hospital in Tu Lai, South Vietnam in April 1969. She worked 12-hour shifts in the intensive care unit treating American soldiers and South Vietnamese civilians. She later requested to work in a Vietnamese ward treating wounded enemy soldiers, believing that all lives deserved care, no matter which side they were on. So Sharon Lane didn't just care for American troops. She treated enemy soldiers too. She wasn't fighting the war. She was fighting to save lives. On June 8th, 1969, the 312th Evacuation Hospital was hit by a Viet Cong rocket attack. A 122-millimeter rocket struck the hospital, killing Lane instantly and injuring 27 others. She was the only American female nurse killed in action due to enemy fire in the Vietnam War. Just a few minutes before the attack, she was seen checking on her patients, demonstrating her selflessness until the very end. So even in a war zone, Sharon Lane's priority were her patients, not herself. That is the definition of a medic. She was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor, the Purple Heart, and the National Defense Service Medal. The Sharon Lane Foundation was established to honor her dedication to military nursing. The VA Medical Center in Canton, Ohio, named its nursing home unit after her. and her story is taught in military and medical training programs as an example of true courage and sacrifice. Why does Sharon Lane matter in the discussion of women in combat? Though she wasn't a combat soldier, she served in a war zone. She faced the same dangers as those on the front lines, volunteered for difficult assignments, and never hesitated to help, even when treating enemy troops. She became a symbol of selfless service, proving that heroism isn't always about fighting. It's about saving lives. So Sharon Lane didn't carry a weapon, but she was just as much a warrior as anyone else in Vietnam. She fought her battle with compassion, and in the end, that's what made her a true hero. So moving on to modern women in combat. In the 21st century, women are now officially recognized as combat soldiers. So starting with Lori Piestewa, 1979 to 2003, Iraq War, Lori was a U.S. Army soldier and the first Native American woman killed in combat while serving in the U.S. military. She was a member of the Opi tribe. She was also the first female U.S. service member to die in the Iraq War. Her sacrifice made her a symbol of courage, service, and representation for Indigenous people in the military. Lori was born on December 14th, 1979 in Tuba City, Arizona on the Opi Reservation. Now, I find this awesome because when I was stationed in Korea, one of my sergeants and a good friend of mine was actually part of the Opi tribe, and that's where he lived. He lived on the Opi Reservation in Arizona. Lori was raised in a military family. Her father was a Vietnam veteran, enlisted in the U.S. Army in 2001, looking for a better future for her two young children. Assigned to the 507th Maintenance Company as a supply clerk and a Humvee driver. So Lori didn't just join the Army for herself. She did it for her kids, her family, and her community. Diving further into her combat experience, March 23rd, 2003, just days after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Lori's convoy took a wrong turn near Nasiriyah, Iraq, and ran into an ambush. The 507th Maintenance Company was hit hard by Iraqi forces. Many soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Lori, driving a Humvee, was hit by enemy fire and crashed into a disabled truck. She suffered severe head injuries in the attack and later died in an Iraqi hospital. So Lori was driving through a war zone, taking enemy fire, doing everything she could to protect her team. That is the definition of a warrior. Next up is Tammy Duckworth, 1968 to present, Iraq War. Tammy Duckworth is a retired U.S. Army helicopter pilot. She's a combat veteran and current U.S. Senator who became a symbol of resilience and advocacy for veterans after losing both legs in combat during the Iraq War. She was one of the first female Army helicopter pilots to fly in combat and later became one of the few disabled veterans to serve in the U.S. Senate. Born March 12, 1968, in Bangkok, Thailand, to an American father and Thai Chinese mother, she grew up in Hawaii and later earned a master's degree from George Washington University. She joined the Army Reserve Officers Training Corps, or ROTC, while in college and became a U.S. Army helicopter pilot, one of the first women to fly combat missions in Iraq. So not only did Tammy Duckworth fly helicopters, she flew them in combat because apparently regular flying wasn't hardcore enough. Tammy deployed to Iraq in 2004 as a Black Hawk helicopter pilot with the Illinois Army National Guard. On November 12, 2004, while flying a mission near Baghdad, her helicopter was hit by an RPG fired by insurgents. Despite her severe injuries, she tried to land the aircraft, but her co-pilot had to take over. She lost both legs and part of her right arm in the explosion, but survived against all odds. Was evacuated to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where she spent over a year recovering. Most people get a scratch and call it a day. Tammy Duckworth got hit by a rocket and still tried to land the damn helicopter. Stories like this are stories that they give me the misties a little bit, because I remember the feeling of serving with women like that in combat. I can only dream of or aspire to be half the women, or half the woman, I guess you would say, that they are. In her post-military career, she refused to let her injuries define her, immediately dedicating herself to veterans advocacy. She became director of the Illinois Department of Veterans Affairs 2006 to 2009, working on issues like disability benefits and mental health support. She appointed Assistant Secretary of Veterans Affairs 2009 to 2011 under President Obama. She was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives 2013 to 2017, and later to the U.S. Senate in 2016, making her the first Thai American woman in Congress and the first disabled female veteran elected to the Senate. So Tammy wasn't just tough enough to survive combat. She went straight from the battlefield to fighting for veterans in Congress. Why does Tammy matter in the discussion of women in combat? Because she was the first female pilot to fly combat missions in Iraq, the first woman in Congress to have served in combat. And she fights for veterans, disability rights, and women in leadership roles, and proves that combat injuries don't mean the end of a career. They're just the beginning of a new fight. Next up, we have Captain Nicola Goddard, 1980 to 2006, Afghanistan. Who was she? So Captain Goddard was a Canadian Army officer and the first female Canadian soldier killed in combat. She was also the first Canadian woman to die in active combat since World War II, and one of the first female frontline officers to serve in Afghanistan. Known for her leadership, grit, and dedication, she shattered barriers for women in combat roles. Born in Madang, Papua New Guinea in 1980, while her Canadian parents were working abroad, she was raised in Canada, highly competitive in sports and driven academically. She joined the Royal Military College of Canada, or RMC, in Kingston, Ontario, where she earned a degree in English and education before commissioning as an officer. She trained as an artillery officer, a role traditionally dominated by men. She deployed to Afghanistan in 2006, assigned to the 1st Regiment Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, and deployed to Kandahar, Afghanistan in 2006. Became a forward observation officer, coordinating artillery and airstrikes for ground troops, one of the first Canadian women in a frontline combat role, breaking decades of military tradition, was well respected among her peers and known for her ability to keep a cool head under pressure. So she's just out here directing firepower and making sure the enemy had a really bad day. May 17th, 2006, during a major battle against Taliban insurgents in the Panjwai district, her unit came under heavy fire. Goddard was in a LAV-3, or light armored vehicle, calling in artillery support when her convoy was ambushed. Hit by enemy RPG fire, she was killed instantly, becoming the first female Canadian soldier to die in combat. She was posthumously awarded the Meritorious Service Medal for her leadership and bravery. Multiple schools and scholarships have been named in her honor, including the Captain Nicola Goddard School in Calgary. Her story has been used to highlight the role of women in modern combat and their contributions to military history. Her service paved the way for future generations of female combat officers in Canada and beyond. Why does she matter in the discussion of women in combat? Because she was one of the first Canadian women to serve in direct combat. First female Canadian soldier killed in action, proving that women are just as involved in frontline warfare as men. A leader who broke barriers in their artillery and combat arms community, and continues to inspire female soldiers and officers worldwide. As we look at 2024, women continue to serve in combat roles across all branches of the military. Today, we see women leading units, commanding warships, and piloting fighter jets in ways that would have been unthinkable a century ago. We've got women in special ops groups. We've got women on FET. I was on FET. We have women in roles of cyber warfare and intelligence. The story of women in combat is far from over, I can tell you that. And technology, warfare, politics, it's all evolving. So too will the role of women on the battlefield. One thing remains constant. I will say this. Their courage, resilience, and determination to fight alongside their brothers in arms. Every day I had the opportunity to fight alongside my brothers in arms was an absolute honor. So unfortunately, wrapping it up, that's it for today's episode of Iron Maidens, guys. Thank you for tuning in to honor the warriors who fought, led, and paved the way for future generations. If you liked this episode, make sure to subscribe and join me next time as we continue to explore the untold stories of women service members and veterans. You can also check out my military fiction book series, Adrenaline Rush, available on Amazon. You can also find me on Facebook under Bevin Goldsmith and Instagram under Bevin Goldsmith. Until next time, stay strong, guys.